have a favorite superhero growing up? If you were anything like me, I was fascinated by the idea of being able to have super abilities. It might fascinate you to know that there's a creature living today that has super abilities. From all of the things that we would be fascinated to be able to have, it can actually do. Today, let's take a look at the water bear, or the tardigrade. You've probably never heard of the tardigrade. Maybe you've heard of the water bear. If you watch the recent Marvel movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp, when he's diving down into some of the smallest microscopic regions, they actually come across some water bears or some tardigrades for a moment. And they don't say much about it, but they do encounter them. Well, this little thing is very, very small. It's about 0.02 inches, depending on some of the sizes of them. And there are about 1,100 different species of it. But these things, as we've said, have super abilities. Let's take a look at just how amazing these things are. They blow my mind. First of all, tardigrades are able to survive extremely low temperatures. No, I'm not talking, like -10, -20. I'm talking like -457.6 degrees. I mean, super, super, super cold temperatures. Again, that was -457.6 degrees. Now, there's something known as absolute zero. Absolute zero is -459.67 degrees. The tardigrades are just two little degrees higher than that, and they're able to survive those temperatures. Now, what's happening at absolute zero is where basically all of the particles come to almost a complete stop, meaning that life is frozen. It is just not moving. And the tardigrade is able to almost go all the way down to absolute zero and yet survive. That's amazing. In fact, they've been found in some of the deepest layers of the Himalayan mountains. So frozen up on the mountains for years and yet able to survive. Secondly, tardigrades have been able to survive temperatures not only super cold, but also super hot. They have been found in the mud of volcanoes and can survive temperatures of 302 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, if they wanted to kind of dive near a volcano, they can do that as well. Third, tardigrades are able to survive enormous amounts of pressure. See, when you go underwater, even if you were to just dive about 12 feet deep, you can start feeling the pressure on your ears. Well, tardigrades are not only able to go deep, they're able to survive at the bottom of Mariana's Trench. Now, the pressure at Mariana's Trench is about 16,000 psi, or pounds per square inch. Well, they're not able to just survive that amount. They're actually able to survive 6 times that amount of pressure. So we're talking upwards of about 94,000 psi that they're able to survive. And just to give a visual representation of this, this would be equivalent to taking 50 jumbo jets, taking 50 747s, stacking them on end all the way up, if you could somehow balance them, and the pressure, if there was a little tardigrade down there, or at least the pounds per square inch, 50 jets lined up, that's how much pressure it is able to withstand without dying. So it can survive just enormous amounts of pressure. Fourth, tardigrades can survive extreme amounts of radiation. Now, radiation is kind of confusing, and the way that they measure it is done in a couple of different ways. There's a measurement of how much is being released, But the one that really matters for us is how much is actually absorbed. So the amount of radiation that's absorbed is measured by what's called grays. Now for us as people, if we absorb between 3 and 6 grays, we're dead. And so we've got to be very careful not to absorb that amount. Again, between 3 and 6, we're dead. Now, you've probably heard that the cockroach is very resilient to radiation. They will say if there was some sort of nuclear apocalypse, that the cockroach would somehow be able to survive the radiation on Earth. Well, cockroaches are able to withstand an unheard of 900 grays. So for us, 3 to 6, cockroach, 900, that's amazing. Well, what about the tardigrade? Well, the tardigrade is able to take in a cool 5,000 to 6,200 grays. So just extreme, astronomical levels of radiation it's able to handle and survive. No problem at all. Fifth, it can also survive without air. Which is kind of fundamental to most parts of life, but somehow the tardigrade or the water bear is able to do this. Now, it's able to survive in water, which is part of the reason it gets its name water bear, but it's also able to go completely without oxygen, which is not common. And the reason we know that is because of this next point. Sixth, it can survive in space. There were groups of tardigrades that were launched into lower Earth orbit where they were exposed to the vacuum of space and solar radiation for 10 days. And so there's no air. They're being exposed to radiation and the vacuum of space. And not only did they survive, but they were even able to reproduce afterwards. So they don't need air. And again, they can even survive in outer space. These things are crazy. Seventh, they can even go without food and water for decades. Not for a couple of months, not for a year, for decades. And last but not least, yeah, they can actually be brought back to life as well. So when they have been exposed to something difficult, what the tardigrade will actually do is go into something called a tun state, T-U-N, tun state, which is almost like a suspended animation for the water bear. And in this state, they will essentially be dead. All life functions will have stopped, and their metabolism will slow to a 0.01% of what it was previously. So they're not technically dead, but they go into a state in which they're not able to sustain any damage, and virtually nothing is even impacting it anymore. They'll even dehydrate themselves in this state so that ice crystals can't form. And it's amazing that they're able to do this. And then when you pour water back on them, they will resuscitate shortly. There was even one study done in the 40s to where they had found some tardigrades in some old moss that had been sitting in a museum for over 100 years. And when they put water back on them, some of them came back to life. Now, this study has yet to be replicated, but that's also partly because you need 100 years of time to be able to try to replicate this type of study. And yet, in this particular one, they found out that they were able to even bring them back to life after 100 years. They're even able to be subjected to multiple layers of these difficulties without a problem. There was one study that was done that said this: tardigrades can survive as tons for years or even decades to wait out dry conditions. In addition, specimens kept for 8 days in a vacuum, transferred for 3 days into helium gas at room temperature, and then exposed for several hours at a temperature of negative 458 degrees, came to life again when they were brought to normal room temperature. 60% of specimens kept for 21 months in liquid air at a temperature of negative 310 degrees Fahrenheit also revived. Calling the tardigrade phenomenal is an understatement. There is simply no animal on Earth that even comes close to the type of abilities that are found in tardigrades. According to evolutionary charts, the tardigrade evolved very early on, about 500 million years ago. What this means is that there have been many animals over time, according to evolution, that have developed directly from the tardigrade's evolutionary line. And so, as this tardigrade is evolving and developing these abilities, and other animals are stemming off of it, they should be developing or maintaining, holding on to some of these same abilities. Okay? So, what animals on Earth then can survive in space? Or what animals can survive, in the mud of volcanoes? What animals can survive for decades without food and water or air? Or survive extreme cold temperatures almost near absolute zero? Or be brought back to life? I mean, there's nothing even close to this. If evolution is truly about gaining abilities, why is there no other animal on Earth that is even remotely close to how special the tardigrade is? It doesn't make sense. All evolution can do in a situation like this is speculate on how something could have evolved like this. To speculate on why don't other animals have these abilities. And it's fine for it to say, yeah, we don't know. The problem is that that's not what is said. You see, in our schools and in our textbooks, it's being touted as fact. Evolution is being touted as fact. And it's chock full of statements about how something probably evolved this way or might have mutated this. And yet it doesn't have the information. It doesn't have the facts. It doesn't have the evidence. Yet it's still being touted as fact and as proof. On both ends of this spectrum, we have the same information. We have what the tardigrade is able to do. We have a lack of evidence showing how this has transferred. A lot of questions to ask on why it hasn't gone to other animals, including us as people, not having even a remote a fraction of these abilities. And so we have the same information, and yet we have to come to a conclusion. For me, leaning on the belief of evolution as being the answer is simply not good enough. Leaning on the belief of God as the answer makes a whole lot more sense. To take a look at these animals and not have all of the answers for their incredible abilities and saying something must have designed this. It must have come from somewhere, and it just simply does not make sense that it could have evolved. For me, the evidence supports the belief of God. In a creature as legendary as the water bear, it seems that the scripture that makes the most sense is Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The evidence is here. What kind of being is able to create something so strong and so resilient as the water bear? It has to be a powerful being. It has to be a powerful God. Once again, just when we feel like we have a grasp on all the ways that animals can do things and how they can function in this life, we come across another one that just doesn't make any sense on how it's able to get an ability. How about a sea slug? There's one particular sea slug, a green sea slug, that's able to do something that it just simply shouldn't be able to do. This particular sea slug is able to carry out photosynthesis. Yeah, it's able to convert sunlight into energy like plants do. And yet it's the only animal that's able to accomplish this feat. In order to accomplish photosynthesis, you actually need a couple of things. First of all, you need to be able to collect the sunlight. Then you need to be able to actually transfer that sunlight into energy. And so what you're going to need are chloroplasts in order to convert the sunlight into energy. But you also need chlorophyll to collect it, then have it transferred or converted through chloroplast into energy. And so for this sea slug, it's actually able to produce chlorophyll, and that's going to give it the green look, and that's going to be able to collect the sunlight that it needs to convert it into energy. The problem is it doesn't have chloroplasts. And so it has to come up with a way to gain that so that it can take this energy and it can form, it can transfer it into its body. Well, it just so happens to eat a particular green algae in which when it's digesting it, it will steal the chloroplasts from that algae, and then it will begin using it in its own body to work together with the chlorophyll. So it eats this algae, it's producing chlorophyll, so it's collecting sunlight, it'll get the sunlight, it'll use the chloroplast that it's stolen from the algae, and then it will convert all of that into energy. And so then what this means is the sea slug is able to go for as long as it wants without food, as long as it has sunlight. I mean, you talk about a clean energy bug, this thing should be on the cover of every solar magazine. I don't know if that would go real well, you know, the sea slug for solar energy. I don't know if that's the best marketing technique, but this thing is using clean energy, and it doesn't even have to eat at all if it doesn't want to. I mean, once again, this thing just reaches mind-blowing levels when we start asking questions about how something like this could develop. I mean, how can evolution know that that can be stolen from algae? How does it know the mechanics of photosynthesis and how to accomplish this within an animal? And maybe most basic of all, which again, why don't we see other animals that have this? I mean, one of the greatest struggles of animals is staying up with the consumption of food. Well, if we could just eat algae all the time and never have to eat food again and just use photosynthesis, why would we not do that? It's so much better, so much easier, and yet it's only seen in this animal. When I look at the sea slug, I see one more evidence of our great creator. I see a creator with creativity. A creator that isn't confined to the boundaries of the way that things work in life. A creator that can say, yeah, I'll give an animal the ability to behave like a plant. Or, as we talked about last week, I'll give a plant the ability to behave like a carnivorous animal in the Venus flytrap. It just blows my mind. What an awesome God we serve.